Welcome to lecture 19, where we will now start to insert the various elements that we've created, symmetry elements and point groups. Well, we're all going to look at them as point groups now because you know the rotation and all that we're going to consider even as a point group. And we're going to insert them into the lattices we created before, which are compatible with rotations and mirror planes. So let's do that, and we're going to go over the first two simple ones, P1 and P2. And this is going to introduce a new combination theorem, rotation translation. Okay, so let's start with P1. So P1 is pretty straightforward. We had our primitive lattice, and you remember our primitive lattice was having a point and a translation vector T1. And then we had, in the completely primitive case, with no special angle between the two, or relationship between the lengths. In fact, the lengths are not equal, even though I drew them there almost as equal. So let's draw this out a little bit. So, you know, if you recall, this is the simple primitive lattice. And if we had object like that, all we would have is that object in space repeated at all the same points. And actually this should be a little bit further down. If you notice, it should be like the same as that one. And so you hang this simple motif off of each one and there's nothing else. Right now the notation is going to be the following. Generally you write a sort of lattice type followed by the point group that you're inserting. And we just derived all those. Well, there is no point group here, so this is a 1. Remember the identity element, it basically does nothing. If we had a 2, it would actually rotate this about here, and we're going to do that next. So it's just a 1, and it's primitive. So if we follow this notation, this is P, and it's a 1. So P is for primitive, and 1 is for the point group 1. Now, this is a small case because that's 2D. If we were to look at this simple 1 in 3D, that actually would be P1 in the international notation because it's three-dimensional. Okay? So far so good. I think you guys should all be fairly comfortable with that. But if we go to P2, actually things start to get a little more complicated right away. Now P2, it makes sense that we want to put in a twofold axis, the rotation, a twofold rotation point group. And the reason is because we know it's compatible. We did the 2mm and we had looked at inserting the twofold axis into the lattice before. So we know that a twofold axis is kind of you know, compatible with the lowest symmetry group, and so therefore it makes sense for us to now say, as we look, what else can we insert in a primitive lattice, and with the lowest symmetry, the twofold point group, rotation point group, makes sense, right? So let's look at that. So let's start by just simply laying it out here. We're saying, okay, you know, if I choose to have this right-handed coordinate system, and this is T1, let's say, and then once again we have, you know, T2. What we're really saying is now we'd like to put at this point a pi, right? That point group of twofold rotation axis. So, you know, we're going to have to look at a combination theorem here a little bit because, you know, remember the way in the past we look at this is to look at some motifs. So let's go over here and do a generic case where I have some rotation about this point of A alpha. Okay, and let's look. And we say, okay, let's imagine that I have some motif here, which I'm going to change the color of, just so that the advantage of doing this on the computer is that we can actually make things a little bit more clear. So let's make that our object in the first place, number one, right? Now, what I'm going to do is rotate that through an angle alpha. So if I rotate it through, it's going to be on this side, right? It's going to have the same symmetry, right-handedness. Right, so it's still right hand, nothing's changed, I just rotated through alpha. Now remember, the point of this is we're trying to combine these two. So if I go back to my notation, remember in our operational notation, what I'm saying is I'm going to have some alpha, I'm going to operate on it with some translation, just to make it specific, some sort of T1. And I'm wondering, you know, what does that produce some other elements into the group that I can think about? And of course, when we do this out, it'll be obvious it does, but we're going to show you here what it introduces. So let's then draw, you know, T1, let's call it. So if I now make T1, translate this over, right, so this was number 2, and then when I went to 3. Now, as we've always done when we look for new operations, so I did the rotation from 1 to 2, and then I did the translation operation on that from 2 to 3, and then we come back to the question is, how is 1 related to 3? Well, first of all, they're the same right-handed, left-handedness. So we already used translation, and you know, I've drawn this like this, but in the generic case, it doesn't lie along the same line. And anyway, that other T is going to have a problem because it's not necessarily symmetric, which means it's going to produce dots that aren't going to be consistent with the other translation. So the bottom line, it's got to be another rotation somewhere, because mirror plane won't work, because remember that this is a right hand, this is a right hand, and this is right-handed. So there's been no flip. Remember, a mirror makes flip. And also you can tell by inspection on this thing, clearly there is a point out here which is a rotation for 1 to 3. So we're going to call it B alpha, and so this equals B alpha. And so that's actually the combination theorem, but we can make it a little bit more precise, because we can say, well, yes, it's going to, I haven't proven that it's the same angle yet, because remember how I said this is alpha. How do I know this is alpha? I'll show you in a minute that's the case. And also I want to show you that it's a specific distance up from this other dashed line that I made here. So if this is, I've drawn here this T1, that means that there has to be essentially, remember T1 over here, right? So if I want to look at, say, a lattice point, I'm going to translate, let me just draw that lattice point, and I'll try to draw it well. There's a lattice point here, because this T1, remember, it's a translation vector, so it better be moving along here and producing another lattice point that A alpha is rotating around. Because remember, the red are motifs, right? They're hanging on this guy. And of course, when I start to look at symmetry, well, of course, this guy better be, this guy. And it turns out that they all have to be T1, because remember that if I'm going to add A alpha in general to this, every rotation of alpha, I better have a translation vector, and therefore a lattice point, because I can't just, all of a sudden have alpha hanging out here. If I translate this one and it's not alpha, it's not going to land on top of that. So you start to realize very quickly that, of course, this must be alpha, this must be T1, if this is all going to make sense, right? And that this must be T1, etc., right? Again, if it's not that, then it's not compatible with the lattice, because if I'm saying I'm going to put in at a lattice point, A alpha, then every alpha, I better, not only have length T1, but it's going to produce, a lattice point there. And of course, you realize that this is T1 also. If I drew it correctly. And you see that makes sense, because the relationship between this motif and T1 has to be the same one as this one, right? And so all of a sudden you realize, well, this is an equilateral triangle, and if I drop this down, this must be T1 over 2, this point here. So now, besides realizing that this angle has to be alpha, which is, of course, now why we know that this is alpha. Right, so we've kind of proven that. And you can see it here, it swings it through alpha about this point. And what we're now able to do is add one more piece of information, is where is it? And the answer is it is at T over 2, this distance away from T1. So we just want to figure out what that distance is. So we'll call that X, right? And of course, if you look at the trigonometry here with T over 2 and alpha being here, right, and I want to find out what X is, right, then I pretty much realize then that if I go over here and write T1 over 2 over X is equal to the tan of alpha over 2. And you can see that because if this is equilateral triangle and this is alpha, then this angle here is alpha over 2. Right? So T over 2 and X and alpha over 2 and tangent become the key. Right? So if you just solve for X, X is, just flip this around. Too much on this U graph, I'm starting to get pixelated. Hopefully you can see that is X equals T over 2 cotan alpha over 2, because bringing this down, bringing this up, flip it around by calling it cotan, and that is the relationship. So hopefully I'm going to erase this just to have a more clear area to write without the pixelization. So let me erase that. And then write down what we've just proven, which is T1 dot A alpha equals B alpha at x equals T over 2 cotan alpha over 2 along bisector of along perpendicular bisector of T. Right, that was that line that came up. So there you go. There's another theorem. It means that when we start to look at the lattice, again, this is a shortcut for group theory, because what it's telling us is in the infinite space group, because remember, once you put in a translation, it's infinite. In the infinite space group, which has an infinite number of members, when I put in alpha, A alpha to be a member of that group, and I have these translations, it means I automatically have all these other rotations located at these other points, automatically. Okay? So those symmetry elements have to be part of the group. And that's what this combination theorem is just telling us. So if we are doing this operation, we fill out our little space group, and we haven't recognized this yet, we can go through and say, aha, I know I'm going to have this other rotation element. If I've missed it, it's got to be there somewhere. Okay, so it kind of tells you what other group member you have to have there. So let's go ahead and apply this then directly to our case of where we started. That's the generic solution, but remember, we wanted to apply it to A over pi, right? Our twofold axis that we want to insert into P1. So we'll make our A pi, and let's build our motif. Right, so let's just pick a point out here. We'll put a motif in. We'll call this our first, that's our first motif. Now A pi says, all right, let's drop this in. And if I can guess where it rotates around, we're gonna, and I've got to draw it well here. Let's see, so the tail, I have to stay with the same right-handedness. So it's going to kind of, if we can do this, swing around like that or something. Something like that. And so then, that's the first step. And then remember, we're going to translate some translation in this direction. And remember, there's a point here that's translated as well. There's a lattice point over here. But we're translating our motif. And then if I make sure I identify the T1 connecting the lattice points, right? Remember, the key thing is the bisector, and we're going to look along the perpendicular. And our theorem is going to tell us where along this I find B pi. Right? So recall that what I'm going to get just from our theorem is somewhere along this line, I know I'm going to have So if we go over here and plug in my, let's just see if I can do this without losing too much resolution. Alpha over 2 equals pi over 2. Right, because pi, right, is our angle alpha, and so alpha over 2 is pi over 2 in our case, which means that the tan of pi over 2, remember that that's equal to the sine of pi over 2 over the cosine of pi over 2, which means that the tan is equal to 1. Oh, I'm sorry, what am I doing? The tan is equal to 1 over 0, right? Which is a problem, but of course we're after the cotan, which is in the inverse, and so that means that x equals 0, right? So sine of pi over 2 is 1, cosine of pi over 2 is 0. If we were focusing on the tan, it'd be a problem, but the cotan is the inverse of that, which is 0 over 1, which is 0. So it says that B alpha is actually located right here. Right, so B alpha is actually right there at x equals 0, where x, remember, was defined as a distance from this point along this perpendicular bisector, and x equals 0, therefore, is right on that line. So what this tells you is that if I'm in my lattice for P1, and lattice for primitive lattice, I've inserted the point group of A pi. I'm going to insert other twofold axis B pi all over the place, and the way you see that is, let's pick a different color here. So when I inserted this, I automatically put a element here, right? And because of translation, I know that symmetry element is going to be over here once I insert that into my space group, right? What our theorem has told us is whatever these motifs look like, you're going to end up actually with one here. So when we say, aha, I'm going to look at these 2 points in between, there's going to be another twofold axis, and you can see how it works here because this guy, right, if you look at, going back to our labeling, remember we did A pi first, then we translated 3. 1 and 3 are related clearly by this rotation about here, as we just suspected, right? So now we can go back and plug this into our lattice without really worrying about it, because now we've kind of got our theorem. We even did the specific case for A over pi. So let's clean up here a little bit and go back and set up our final diagram for P2. So if I go back to our speculative thing, we'll call this T2, and we had set up a right-handed coordinate system before in this way, T1. Let's draw the standard cell like this. So that should be the same over here, whatever. And let's draw in our motifs. Actually, let's draw in the first. So what we know is I'm inserting one of these guys at every lattice point, right? Because that's what I just did, right? I mean, that's what I'm doing in this whole exercise, and that means that when I look at a motif, I'm going to have, let's say, again, excuse my approximation that this should be this guy, rotated through, right? And trying to replicate that over here. So I didn't do it probably far enough away, but you get the point. And then this guy's over here. And this guy is over here. And drawing this well actually makes a huge difference, because then you'll see the other symmetry elements with inspection that actually are, oops, I did that wrong, that are our theorem has helped us out with, right? So we saw is that, between the lattice points and two-fold axis, we're going to have new two-fold axes. So for sure, we're going to have one here, right? And you can see that, first of all, because of this, right? So that means we definitely have one here, because this translation means that that guy exists, right? Let's pick blue. It also means that along this one I have that, right? And through translation, I have that over here. And you can see that because, see, I mean, if I draw it correctly, you see that it spins about this point, right? Now if I look carefully, I'll say, aha, if I take a translation vector through here, remember any translation vector, from one lattice point to another is going to have it. So I have to have a two-fold axis in the middle. And there you have it. And so there's our P2. It's very exciting, our first complicated one. And it is fairly complicated in the sense that we started with a simple idea. We got a theorem which said that in between here and here I needed this one, here and here I need this one. The motifs you see are very important to show you the independence of these axes. Notice how when I made this one I said, aha, here's a translation vector. Because remember, T1, T2 don't equal each other. So, this one had to have one, and this one had one too, but it's different because the translation vectors are different, and the theorem just says, hey, if I've got two-fold axes, I have to have one in between. And then same thing with the diagonal, right? So notice that here I have 4 in each cell. There's 4 kinds of independent two-fold axes. And you can see that with the pattern, because the pattern around the magenta, the pattern around the green, the pattern around the cyan, and the pattern around the blue are different. This blue one has these guys that are fairly close. The cyan is the one I started off with the basic motif that I hang at each lattice point. The green, right, has this long throw between these guys and this guy. And the magenta has a long throw between here and here and here and here, right? So you can see that there's 4 independent types of two-fold axes in P2. So this is a great example of how the symmetry elements, if I take the motif away, if I take all the reds, motifs away, I look at this, I say, yeah, there's just two-fold axes everywhere, right, bisecting all the translation vectors. Oh, and that's why you could see the magenta too. I did the diagonal, but you can see it here that if I'm going to have these guys, right, there's two-fold axis with a T1 between them, and so you're going to have one here too. And, but it shows you very nicely how that the symmetry elements can be independent. Now, I could have done this by inspection, because when I put these two guys here and I repeat them everywhere, I could have identified this, I could have identified this, So I could have identified all of these by inspection. What we're really doing is saying this rotation combination, this translation rotation combination theorem, tells me which group members I have to have. So if this is going to be a valid group, right, it means that, well, when I have these guys and this guy, I'm going to create this other group member. When I have, these group members, I create that one. When I have these guys, I create that one, and so on. And so that builds up the whole real space group. If I'm missing any of these elements, it won't be a space group, because eventually I'll see that two of these other members creates another symmetry element in the lattice. And so it's a really nice example of all those features as we put our 2D space groups together.